At the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Paul Newnham, who Paul coordinates the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub Secretariat, incubated by the World Food Programme. He works together with NGOs, agricultural networks, nutritionists, campaigners, civil society, the private sector, and United Nations agencies to coordinate advocacy efforts and achieve SDG 2 targets by 2030. Today, we're going to be discussing the Chefs Manifesto, biodiversity, sustainability, and food waste. Paul, it's amazing to have you here. You're a busy man traveling all across the world, so it's great to have you at the studio. Thank you for coming.
Not a problem. Great to be here.
So, what were you doing earlier today? You were telling me a moment ago, but what has the rest of your day looked like up till now?
Yeah. So after a bit of an early morning gym session and some time with the family, I caught up with a team that's looking at starting up the Chefs Manifesto Hub in Ireland at GIY Ireland, which is in Waterford. And so we had a bit of a chat with them at our London and Global Hub.
Okay.
So talking with Chef Arthur Potts-Dawson and the team from GIY just about what is involved in creating kind of a hub for the Chefs Manifesto and what are the ways to, I suppose, engage the chef community in that. And so it's an interesting process because the Chefs Manifesto as a movement, I would say, or
for those
network.
who aren't familiar, what is the Chefs Manifesto? What? Because I got introduced this when we first met, and I think that was kind of early 2018.
Yeah.
And I found it absolutely fascinating to see that there were chefs coming together under more than just kind of for an awards ceremony or to kind of blow smoke up each other's asses. And so it was interesting to see that in some way chefs kind of coming together, but looking at the kind of bigger picture of what their role is in society and in the world. Yeah.
So the Chefs Manifesto was established not too long before or after we kind of connected, but it came out of this conversation which was looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and saying, how do we look at the conversation around food, agriculture, nutrition, and encourage greater engagement? And what we realized was that often that conversation was being had by people that weren't necessarily involved day to day in food. And people like chefs and farmers were on the edges of that conversation. And so particularly with chefs who have such a key part in our world today in terms of media, in terms of conversations around nutrition, it feels like every time you turn, someone's asking, how a chef to help solve some sort of problem around what we eat and how you get your kids to eat and how we affect climate change. Everything now seems to be kind of coming back to chefs as part of that solution. And so we started to sort of say, well, why aren't chefs in the conversation around the advocacy? Why are we not bringing them into the room in some of these spaces?
Because these are the guys in the front line of all this, right?
Exactly. And what we found was that there was a lot of chefs actually involved. Mm-hmm. They were in a lot of the conversations, but they were talking particularly from very specific issues. So you'd have people talking on food waste in a particular part of the world, or on sustainability in a particular part of the world, or on water in a particular part of the world, or nutrition. So what you would find is there was very much, and they would also then be divided by chefs working in food development, research, fine dining, corporate catering, all these different elements. And so you found that it was very divided. There was lots of people working on sustainability, a lot of action happening, but that conversation didn't necessarily reach the global conversation because it wasn't
unified. Maybe in
there was
any
no
way,
way, there was no
fragmented
narrative. So what we found was, how do we create some sort of common narrative? A way for us to actually talk about all the parts being as important to achieve the whole. Because I think sometimes what happens is you become as an expert in anything. Mm-hmm. You go deep. And so you become an expert. So you might be a particular type of chef. You become very good at a particular thing. You become passionate about that issue. Yeah. Those stories. And
that's what you come to represent. That's what is reflected in your food, in your restaurant, in your
And that's the same in our research, in our universities, in all kinds of stuff.
Sure.
But what we find is when you look at the Sustainable Development Agenda, there is a connection between the different depths. So you've got to have a collaboration, because people don't work in isolation from one another. Problems aren't in isolation from one another. They're connected. And so you need to find a way to see the relationship. I often describe it as like the global waterbed. You know, with those old-fashioned waterbeds, you would jump on and the other person would bounce off. And I think a lot of what I saw around sustainability was also like that waterbed example, where somebody would push down in a particular area and achieve an awful lot. But then in many ways, it would push out into another area. And so you would sort of see somebody really fighting waste, but in doing so, maybe they would encourage, lack of biodiversity, or they would have a lack of nutrition or flavor or something. There would be something that you're focused deep on, and you'd lose something else. And so what we saw was we need a system. We need a narrative that connects all the conversations as part of each other, but allows for those depths, because you don't fix things if you don't go deep as well. So it's this kind of paradox or challenge, I suppose. So we started to say, how do we create that? And so we looked around. We at first didn't want to create anything. We wanted to find something that we could join and get behind. And what we found was all these different fragmented conversations. And so we said, okay, let's bring it all together. Let's think, could we create some common narrative, and what would we base it on? And the problem is, when you start thinking about these kinds of issues, you can go forever. So we said, well, we need a bookend. What's the bookend going to be that we can kind of build off? And so we chose the Sustainable Development Goals, which all the countries of the world with the UN in 2015 signed on to. And they're essentially an agenda of 17 goals that are seen to be very interconnected. That have alongside them a framework, a thinking that ties under each goal into a series of measurements and approaches. And so we said, let's look at that as our backstop, as our kind of bookend, and use that to say, well, what can chefs contribute to this agenda? And so we then interviewed chefs.
And that's what I really appreciated, is when you were telling me initially, I remember about the Chefs Manifesto, is this idea that because it's in the same kind of idea as what you were talking about with the waterbed. When you talk about sustainability, if you ask 10 people, you'll get like 11 answers, right? And they'll all be completely different, and they'll be focused in different areas. And what I really liked with the Chefs Manifesto is it seemed that everyone in some way could be singing off the same hymn sheet, that all of a sudden it started to kind of give all chefs a kind of baseline as to kind of judge the sustainability as well of their operations and what they're working on.
Yeah, so I mean, that's essentially where we ended up with, was eight areas, which was in language that chefs put forward. So it was kind of written by chefs for chefs, and we kind of then under each of those 8 areas created actions that chefs can do in their own kitchen, things they can ask others to do, and how they can advocate. And that creates kind of this framework, which then you can start a conversation.
So taking it from really abstract kind of big global goals into what can you actually do as a chef to contribute towards this in your kitchen in a meaningful way, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the moment, there's a lot of the media is filling us with all this conversation about these big problems, which we're not necessarily moving on. And so I think what the Chefs Manifesto does is say, let's take that, the framework for those big problems, but let's put action behind it that comes down to a kitchen and comes down to what we do and the choices we make in our kitchens and how we can contribute to the solutions that ladder back up to that global problem. And so I think that's why the Chefs Manifestos gain the momentum that it has, because people have said, hey, this is a way for us to start to talk, to share, to learn from one another. And in a way done that's looking at this from a global learning, not just from a North America or Africa or
that's something that really kind of hit me when I came along to one of the Chef Manifesto events. Was you're not just dealing with chefs or kind of like famous popular chefs with a big message and big platform who are talking about their beliefs and ideas. You're talking about people who really care about these issues and are working with communities and working with people to really be the change that they want to see, right? And I found that really, really inspiring as well, about the type of people who are being kind of attracted to the Chefs Manifesto and this movement, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes down to it, we're in a position at the moment where it's an emergency. I mean, the climate emergency has been declared in a number of countries, but the world's in a real point of emergency, and that means we can't afford to just kind of wait for somebody to lead us out of this. We actually need everyone all at once doing their bit. And so to do that, and there's a benefit because you get the learnings of what's happening. You get multiple experiments happening all over the world.
Sure.
But you also get those combined learnings and that combined action, which can hopefully accelerate some of the change. So where we kind of set up as part of this was, let's make sure we don't just bring one type of chef in. Yeah. Let's bring chefs from all different types. Let's also acknowledge that countries are all very different. They come from very different starting points. Sure. There's culture, there's flavor, there's taste, there's legal environments. There's all kinds of elements, even climate, that affects what food is available and how people eat. And it's the same for chefs. They all are operating in those spaces. So let's bring all of them into a conversation and see where we can find solutions. I mean, I was super excited the other day. I was talking with a partner of ours that's based in East Timor.
Okay.
So down in the second youngest country of the world. Most people, you say, where's East Timor? They don't even know. But it's an amazing country. And in this place, there's a food studio called Agora Food Studio.
Okay.
And Agora Food Studio said, I got connected through a friend of mine who lives in East Timor, and she goes to it's her local coffee shop. And so she said, when I was telling her about what I did, she said, you should check these guys out. And so since then, we've met in Stockholm. We've had conversations on the phone regularly. These guys are doing this project where they're really in a country that really has a lack of infrastructure because it was very badly damaged during occupation and a number of different issues, war and different things. And so it also has a very young population that it's having to kind of help build and invest back into to build the future of the country. But there's this food studio which is saying, okay, how do we celebrate the food that we have here and what does that look like? But let's also think about sustainability. Let's think about the nutritional makeup of what our people are eating, but also what our staff are eating. And so they came up with this model and they showed me this dashboard that they're using. It's a live dashboard that connects to their point of sale.
Okay.
All digitized, that comes out and shows how the impact is that the restaurant is having according to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Wow.
So they're basically showing how many plastic straws are saved, how many investment into the local economy through buying local products, how much coconut oil is being used from the country, how many nutritious meals are being served.
And they're gathering all this data?
All this data is coming from the restaurant so that any customer can log in and see live on the site at any point.
And do you think we'll see more of that in the future?
Well, I was like, this is like the best I've ever seen of any like coming from East Timor, it was not where I expected.
Yeah, well, sure. This is part
Silicon
of the
Valley,
part
absolutely.
Of it.
Downtown London, absolutely. But I looked at this, and so we're now having a call next week with chefs from 12 countries to talk about could we pilot this model across the world. So I think what this shows is that solutions are going to be found in unexpected places. And if we want to accelerate change, we can't just keep looking to the current leaders or the people that we expect. We've got to be looking under, places in different corners of the world to see where is the next innovation going to come? Where is the next breakthrough? And that's just one example. It's one small one, but it was just so profound because
definitely.
I would never think of East Timor as a technology leader, maybe in the future, but at the moment, no. And I was like, here's a technology solution, looking at sustainability, showing measurement that's far better than many restaurants I've seen. And I'm like, how did you do that? Why did you do that? And it was...
And why did they do that? What was their kind of drove them to doing something like that in a country so as you said, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw that in New York, London, or kind of a lot of other kind of westernized countries. You'd expect that that's great because maybe it attracts potential customers, people let's say more or want to consider themselves as being more educated when it comes to kind of sustainability and even being able to trace their foods and knowing the kind of impact of, how they're consuming, what impact that's having on the world. But I guess I didn't expect that in somewhere like East Timor. And you kind of think, right, what got them towards thinking about that?
So I think it's partly the people. And so the people who run this space came from a development agenda. So they'd been working there in the development field, and they noticed that the food scene, was a real challenge. Yeah, food is so central to everything we do. It's a means of employment. It's a means of life. It connects to farmers, and so they started to say, okay, well, how do we look at addressing this, demonstrating, stimulating, thinking about a conversation? So they started to do that. And then as they just started to think about that, they said, how do we measure how successful we are? And how do we do that in a simple way so that we can feed that back?
Yeah.
Because they're like any new restaurant startup, trying to demonstrate impact and value. And so they're doing that. They're putting on obviously good food, and they're doing that. But they also have this story around sustainability. So they said, well, let's come up with a solution. And we don't have time to be, manually entering everything. So let's come up with a technology solution. And I think they said somebody volunteered, gave them a little bit of help to do the coding initially. And, and they still do a few things manually. They weigh their compost, and things like that because they haven't got an automated system. But they wanted to do it to demonstrate impact. And as they did it, at first they were like, but as the numbers start to build, they start going, wow, look at this impact. The numbers going up. We're really making a difference here, which then inspires them to make more of a difference. So I think storytelling is absolutely critical, and that's one of the drivers. But I also think there's
you see, that's, for me, the problem is sometimes storytelling overtakes the actual reason why chefs are engaged. So that's why it's so interesting to see that coming out of somewhere like East Timor, because that's coming from much more of a genuine place where people, and this is what I kind of come back to again with the Chefs Manifesto, is I didn't feel like this was people trying to push their PR agenda and their story and craft or curate their kind of persona and what they're kind of advocating. This felt like people who are much more tuned in to the needs of their environments and the societies that they operate within.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that's just one example. There's a number of others where people are looking to be more authentic in the way that they engage in the food scene, to see how the food that they present and that people enjoy and the experience that comes from that is also having an impact. And is having a positive impact on the farmers, so the ecosystem around food is really important. And as people who are passionate about food, which all chefs are, then that naturally becomes a nice marriage that happens.
Sure.
And so the framework of the manifesto just enables that conversation to be connected to a UN agenda, which is really critical. And food is a central part to that agenda.
So you speak to an awful lot of chefs and you from all over the world. Why are chefs all over, why is it this kind of movement now? Why is it attracting chefs? Why are chefs all over? Because if you think about it, traditionally chefs are business owners. They're out to make a profit, especially small restaurateurs. You think that's kind of their primary goal, not necessarily saving the world. Why is there this shift now? Why is it that chefs are starting to really not only kind of try and tackle these issues within their kitchen, but also kind of educate people around them about it? Why is that becoming so important?
So I think it's coming from two ways. I think there's parts of the world where there's a general awareness around sustainability and impact that's continuing. So that's happening in places like the UK, where all of a sudden public campaigns around plastic and things like that are putting huge pressure on business.
Sure.
So if you want to run a business, you have to bring about those changes. So it's a kind of regulatory framework or movement of the public that's driving the
Sure.
change. And so I think some chefs are just playing catch up.
Yeah.
But then I think there's also this new generation of chefs, and some of them are older and some of them are younger, that are really going back to acknowledge the crafts that contribute to their craft.
Mhm.
So ingredients, the importance of provenance, and how ingredients are grown and sourced, and the flavor profiles that come from that, and the biodiversity and the importance of localization and how things are grown. And as the world's shifting, as climate's shifting, as water access is shifting, all these kind of issues, I think chefs are having to fight harder to ensure that they have access to that pantry or that larder. I mean, if you see, I had one chef explain to me that the chef's job is to protect the world's pantry or the world's larder. The chef is the guardian of that larder. And at first I went, okay, tell me more. And they said, well, if they don't use the ingredients, respect the ingredients that we have, they'll be lost. They won't be grown, they won't be cultivated, they won't be protected, and they won't exist. We see lots of ingredients disappearing. And so I think part of why chefs are doing this is necessity, that they see that if they don't understand, they don't protect, they don't engage, they're not going to have what they need to trade in to create that. But I also think it's a passion as well, where they're really keen to learn more and be, lots of chefs they're involved in wanting to learn. It's a learning space. They want to learn about new flavors, tastes. They're very inquisitive. They research,
there seems to be a lot of people as well who kind of want to go back to as well their roots, right? Yeah. And kind of champion maybe some of the kind of local ingredients from their native countries. I think you were just about to mention Virgilio Martinez, weren't you? So so that was kind of passing through my mind as you were talking. I was thinking, this kind of started in the higher echelons of gastronomy, right? In a way, I mean, if you look at, this whole idea of the provenance and terroir of where your ingredients come from, if you think about, the Cella de Can Roca, I remember them having a dish on the menu that was oysters with a distillate of the soil from the earth around their restaurant. And you think, well, that's great if you have great quality soil around you. I wouldn't choose to do that in London maybe, but it was kind of emphasizing this idea of kind of really appreciating the land where you're from, and even the soil is something that can be beautiful and can be kind of edible if you appreciate it in the right way. But then it seems to have since then kind of, as I said, I think there are a lot of chefs as well who have taken that and maybe pay tribute to it to some degree. But what you're talking about is people who really believe in these ideas, and they actually take it to heart, and they want to reconnect people in their country with the ingredients. They want to see farmers prosper. They want to see the overall kind of environment. They want to be part of that shift towards making sure that they're preserving something that's great and unique about their land as well.
Yeah, and I think those big names have elevated, but I think they've rediscovered something of the past. I actually think this is goes back to the way, I hear people talk about, say, for example, in Italy, the different provenance in each place that was passed on by families as ingredients that were respected. And I think a lot of what's happened in different parts of Africa, in different parts of Latin America, and Europe, everywhere's got some stories around this. And I think then as we globalized, we lost something of those stories. Definitely. We appreciated these global flavors, these global trends. And I think now the big name chefs have gone back and basically brought a new appreciation and elevated some of these cuisines to say, but let's not forget this. Gaston Ecurio going in, in a canoe down the Amazon, finding all these ingredients and coming back and then creating a space for them to celebrate them, and a way of consuming them and pairing them and reminding people of their importance. And you see this, with Alex Atala, so many different chefs in different parts.
As you were saying, it kind of reminded me of someone like René Redzepi, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he and the New Nordic Cuisine Manifesto as a whole kind of created a restaurant scene and space that had otherwise not existed in Nordic countries before. I mean, if you think 20 years ago when people thought of Nordic cuisine, pretty much like how they see British cuisine, as in it was kind of maybe known for one or two main kind of hallmark dishes, but other than that, no one really would have considered them gastronomic, and especially a kind of gastro-tourism destination. And I think there's huge money in that as well that has led other countries maybe to kind of think, oh, well, maybe there's a good story in our cuisine. There's a lot of kind of rich heritage here that we haven't exploited. And I think that must be a big part of it as well, right? Is that they're now people who are going out there eating, they want more, they want a meaningful meal, they want something that's interesting, they want something that's experiential, they want something that's kind of authentic in a way. And I think I've at least seen that that's given rise to an awful lot of countries now that are looking to kind of weave these stories and rekindle maybe some of the heritage of their gastronomic past or the ingredients that they have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that has, as the world's been more connected and globalized in that way, and you can get online and food is something that's very much shared.
Yeah.
People are connected to cuisines, and they then connect that with experience and place. And experience has become a key part of food, and that's been a tradable commodity, I suppose, alongside that food, is those experiences and the natural kind of engagement that goes around them. And so I think that has been something that, in the sustainability side, has been another lens that goes through. But I kind of, when I look at it, there is trends in that can happen. Mm-hmm. But I also think, there's elements where we see the challenge of not appreciating that food.
Sure. Because
what we do is we lose a lot of the benefits or the knowledge. And so, like, talking with chefs in India, there's a chef, Manjit Gill, who's in charge of the heritage for the World Chef Association. He's the president of the World Chefs there, 40 years experience. But he talks a lot about the ingredients and the learning and the knowledge around each ingredient, the role it plays in the meal. And I think, if you think about some of that experience, it's also about health, it's about well-being,
sure.
It's about tradition, culture. So I don't think it's all comes down to a trend or a tourism angle, because they would see that this is a part of being Indian or having a proper food. There's a whole mantra and approach around that. And so I think, there's people are coming from all these different angles. And I think if we circle to the Chefs Manifesto, the way that fits as a platform is it creates a narrative where they can then start to bring all of these different perspectives, these different reasons, the motivations, whatever they're coming from, and share their contribution within that story, and also learn and hear from others to be able to say, well, how do we then approach that for our space?
And so what are the main kind of hot topics that a lot of chefs all around the world are talking about when it comes to achieving the strategic development goals? What are the ones that are really high up on the list that we kind of really want to be focusing on?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's what people are talking about, and then there's what maybe makes the most impact, So, some of the hot button topics are waste. Obviously, waste is a big one. And waste is something that's captivated lots of chefs as well as lots of sustainability experts, as well as the public.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think waste is definitely a key thing we should be focused on. And waste in certain parts of the world is quite significant. We grow enough food now in the planet to feed the planet 1.5 times. Yeah. But, we also then have hungry, over 800 million people.
Yeah.
Yet we're throwing away all this food. So there's this kind of like hypocrisy and imbalance that happens where we've got enough food to feed everyone. We're wasting all this food.
Well, we're worried about feeding 9 billion people when we have enough food on Earth to feed 9 billion people. That's kind of projected for 2050. But it is a lot of it comes down to logistics, right? Exactly. And how the distribution element of how we're...
And it's about, how you look after food, how you choose to use it. In the fine dining world, a lot of it's about cutting a whole massive whole vegetable down into a tiny square to get it perfect. There's then a lot of waste there. But then on the catering side, it's like we all want buffets where we get to choose, a ridiculous amount of food, and that then generates waste.
Sure.
We want particular cuts of meat where we, all like a particular style of meat. And this is where trends become challenging sometimes, because what they do is because of the globally connected market now, that trend generates huge amount of waste, because one particular dish or one particular style becomes kind of what everyone expects, and they've got photos of it and they want to see it look exactly the same. And so it changes the food scene globally at a level that is kind of quite scary. So, I mean, to me, waste is one of these impacts. But, I think sometimes we put too much attention on waste. I mean, it's important, and I'm not in any way, but I also think, waste is generated through what we eat and consumption.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of effort should be put on what our expectations are around food. And I don't think we should be telling people what they should and shouldn't be allowed to eat. I think very much food is something that's a right that people should have the ability to eat what they want. But I think what they need to realize is that different types of food have different impacts, both on you and the planet.
Sure.
And we should probably eat them in different amounts based on that. And there's reasonable science out there that kind of explains that. And I think the challenge is when we start to think about that at a global level, because we want a global answer. And the world's not perfect that way. We have to look at localities, and that's where it becomes different.
Well, I see. The funny thing is, when it comes to something like food waste, it's become massively popular in the mainstream media, and a lot of chefs are talking about it now. But I've always been on the side thinking, well, restaurants, I don't think generally, depending on the type of restaurant, depending on what you're doing, but especially in the fine dining level, waste has never been a big issue, purely because you can't afford it. And I think a lot of the food waste, although there are a lot of chefs talking about food waste or focused on food waste, I think that is important. But I do think that there's so many other parts of the food chain where waste is happening. I think restaurants are probably, producing significantly small portion of that. And I think, whether it's at home or in supermarkets or big industry, I think we see a lot more food waste coming from there than for chefs to kind of, like, it's really interesting. It's great to have a kind of zero waste restaurant or a zero waste kind of, food business. But I think that's always kind of partially been built into restaurateurs and chefs, is that kind of wanting to make sure that they use up as much as they can of everything. And I think that at least looking at kind of traditional cuisine that I kind of was trained in, you didn't leave anything to waste. It was just you couldn't afford to do that. That just wasn't how you rolled, in a way.
No, a number of chefs, they often say, if you're a good chef and well trained, there shouldn't be any waste in the kitchen. It's not that. Obviously, stuff comes back on plates, things like that. But you adjust your menu. You kind of create. But this is where I think the waste conversation. And don't get me wrong, all these conversations are important. I just think sometimes the waste conversation
dominates.
It's almost like if we solve waste, we've solved the problem. Well, actually, no, we haven't, because it's not the only answer. It's one area. And so we do need people to demonstrate, to keep it front of mind, to make us think about how we're wasting. I think, in many ways, seasonality is another important thing that often doesn't get the attention that maybe it should.
Okay.
Because we all want to eat the same thing every year, everywhere.
Well, we want strawberries in December, right?
And we want to, people in Iceland want to eat blueberries, and they want to eat raspberries all year round,
And if you don't find them in that supermarket, you'll go to
another one.
Yeah,
exactly. And so I think the seasonality is something that doesn't get the conversation that it maybe should. And even in restaurants.
Are chefs talking about it? That's what I was going to say.
So there are some chefs that are, and there's a lot of restaurants that will look at seasonality. And I know we have a number of partners that are looking at that, where they put on different, menus based on the season, and they will shift the menu based on the season. And I think that thinking and encouraging people to eat that way is very different. But that doesn't happen at the moment. because we have this idea of what a plate looks like and how we should eat it.
See, that was quite important to us, even with the chef's table. It became important like several years ago, this idea of, making sure that the menu is seasonally adjusted, making sure that we're not kind of serving, asparagus in the dead of winter, and kind of that for me was really important as part of that kind of authentic narrative of the menu and journey that you're taking people on. And you're right. I think with chefs, there's some degree of like a decent degree of awareness, but I think consumers, I think that's where we're really lacking. And I think if you asked most people when certain ingredients are meant to be in season, they actually wouldn't have an idea of when you're supposed to get rhubarb or asparagus or strawberries or oranges or citrus fruits or whatever it may be. I think your average person would really have no idea what the seasons are and where the ingredients are grown.
Yeah, and I think where ingredients come from or what makes sense is also something that doesn't, really register. And I think that's where more education could be put, and that would change waste. Do you know what I mean? Because
sure,
you're gonna eat more seasonally, so when things are in plenty, you're gonna eat a lot of them. You're gonna get used to eating a lot of them, and that's the way traditionally things used to be.
Sure,
but they've fallen.
Well, that was the only way.
It was the only way, and so some of the solutions, I think, and this is part of where the systems, as a food system, has become challenging. Is we've then reduced down these commodities that we focus on. So in biodiversity, from a biodiversity perspective, there's 30,000 edible foods in the world.
Yeah,
and of them, we eat about 150 in the majority of our diet, and out of that, there's 4 that make up 60% of the calories that most of the world get.
Wow.
And so when you think about 30,000 brought down to 150, down to 4, and you start to think about that. So those
4 are responsible for over 60% of the calories
that the global population.
Because I remember reading something about like in South America where maize accounts for about 20% or 25% of the calories that people consume, and I thought that was amazing. But then you read that maize, rice, wheat, these are what we're really kind of sustaining people on, right?
Exactly. And then it becomes your universal diet that everyone expects, that everyone needs. Now what happens then is we lose our biodiversity. Now if you know anything about farming, it requires different nutrients. So to grow those 4 crops en masse every year requires lots of inputs, which changes the dynamic of the food. It gets, there's a lot of diseases, resistance, all these kinds of things. Now, there's a lot of research that goes on in the CGIAR system around the world into those crops and different varieties and looking at them. But as the climate's changing, as, things are happening, we're very vulnerable as well because we're reliant on these
so like from a food security perspective, right?
So, for example, things like bananas.
I was reading about this.
Bananas, so that people basically started to kind of go, there was all these varieties of bananas.
Yeah.
And everyone started to go, well, let's think global market. Everyone wants bananas all year round. Yeah. Let's think how we do it. So then a certain type of banana was selected.
Yeah.
But it wasn't selected for flavor. It was selected for look and for transportability. Wow. And so you end up with this one type of banana then going global. And the problem is then you get one pest attack that banana and you've wiped out your whole banana stock.
Wow.
Because there's no diversity. So in a field that's diverse, if some pest eats one crop, you get the other one. Or if you've got 2 varieties, something happens. So when we've reduced down our biodiversity, and this also ties back to seasonality, you end up with this. And I also think then if you connect that on, it connects to the price of food because those commodities, in order to be en masse available, have been reduced down. So the price becomes very cheap. So they're very easy to waste because they don't cost much. Yeah. Bread is very cheap. Is it bread? Is it made in the same way? Yeah. No, it's not made in the same way. The Bakers Guild used to, I heard a story, you get locked up if you messed up the bread, like there was police that would monitor the bread, and then all of a sudden industrialization happened and bread became this thing that's no longer valued, and it's not even nutritious. You know, it's a filler. And so,
well, that's the problem with a lot of foods that we're eating these days, and that's why you have, you know, I think it's, as you're saying, kind of 800 million people who are hungry and malnourished in that sense. And then you have this kind of like, what is it? 60% of the world's population is now kind of like middle class.
Yeah.
But obesity and malnutrition on
2
that
billion
side
people now.
It's
growing
huge issue.
Really, really quickly. And so you've got people that are hungry who are obese. You know, like you've got like these really weird situations where people are lacking nutrients, but they're overweight, you know, and because they're eating the wrong things, you know, and this is where I think the system's broken, because what we've done is we've kind of said, and it's I think sometimes it's unintended consequences. Like we've tried to solve the hunger problem by bringing the cost of food down and getting calories to everyone, and in doing that we've made calories very cheap, but maybe lost nutrients.
I agree.
You know, and
compromised on flavor, compromised on so many of the other elements that we should be appreciating about food, but we put ahead of that the need to feed large populations. I agree.
And then we backfill by going, oh well, let's fortify it. Let's do this. Let's take the food that's maybe not as nutritious and let's add the nutrients to it, which I think is good practice and best case if you don't have the diet that already comes with that.
Sure.
So en masse, much better to fortify, to add iron, you know, iron and iron dyes, salt, and you know, these kinds of things. If you're going to not have that for the mass population, but much better to get a balanced, seasonal, nutritious diet. You know, but we kind of go, oh, that's too expensive, or that's not, you know, scalable on mass. So I think some of these challenges, you know, biodiversity kind of ties in, but it also connects back to waste. And it connects, and, you know, lately there's been a bit of a conversation of, you know, sustainability, is that moving into resilience? What does resilience look like? And how do you move past just being sustainable, which is to kind of keep it going, to like resilient, which means,
interesting.
You know,
Tell me
it's
more.
an interesting. So it's a new kind of conversation that's been happening, but it's some of the chefs that are involved have been talking a little bit about, you know, sustainability is no longer enough. What if we go into resilience? And how do you think about, you know, building in, you know, post-sustainability, the ability for safe self-generation, soil health, you know, so you start looking at the system. I mean, it's similar concepts, but it's just thinking past just sort of sustainability means keeping the current, you know, it's the
status
current
quo
system.
and just keeping it going.
Whereas resilience means being able to survive, you know, and I think there's something about the current world which you'll look at different models as things go on, you know, this climate emergency. I mean, people say that, you know, certain parts of the land have got X number of harvests left, you know, 60 harvests left in them, you know, and with soil health really low, how that's being regenerated, what that looks like when there's just monocropping going on en masse for miles and miles and miles, you know, we could be in a real problem where soil's dead and climate's changed. How do we feed people? And that's a very different, you know, then looking at different solutions and need to become part of that thing. And that's maybe not going back to some, you know, some of these more ideal solutions that we've had in the past. It's actually thinking very differently. And so, I mean, this is where there's no one answer. And one of the things that comes up, you know, another one of the big issues that's big at the moment connected to climate is obviously, and particularly in North America and Europe, is the amount of meat-based proteins that are being eaten versus vegetable-based protein, you know, vegetables and stuff.
So I was going to ask you about this, because this is really interesting, right? How that part of our diet and consumption is transforming. So would you say that a lot of the chefs that you work with, is there that kind of hyper awareness towards plant-based diets and avoiding meat, and is that kind of something global, or is that something that we're really bombarded with as messaging here in the West?
So I think it's shifting very quickly. I mean, if you talk to certain chefs, they would say that one of the problems has been, you know, as people move into the middle class, the perception is you move your diet towards
Sure.
a more Western diet, which is meat heavy.
I think
or
China is
animal-based
one of
proteins.
those, right?
China, India, but like even India, which is like probably one of the
Oh, really?
one of the continents or countries which has had, a vegetarian base to most of its diet, a very strong vegetarian influence, is shifting very quickly to meat-based proteins.
Wow.
And so you're seeing that happen very quickly. And, it's not happening maybe at the level of, say, China, but you are seeing that happen. And it's really interesting because their cuisine celebrates vegetables in such a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing that also in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well, where, there's been more starches and plant-based, but now moving towards more animal-based proteins as people, find more income.
Yeah.
And so I think, in the chef world, there definitely is awareness. In our network, we've looked a lot at some of the research that's come out, things like the Eat Lancet report, which talks a little bit about, how do you feed a population by 2050 and what would the global plate look like in order to avoid the 2 degrees warming. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of that report and a lot of debate. I think most of that criticism and debate is like people saying, oh, you're telling me not to eat meat, and it's actually, they haven't, if you've read even the summary, that's not what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically saying that, we need to have a much more balanced diet. And there's certain parts of the world that are eating way too much of certain things and not enough of others for us to be sustainable. And there's other parts that are not eating enough of certain things. And then, so it's about that. And that goes back, I think, to one of the biggest challenges in this is that people want these absolutes. And so one of the things I've been noticing, and this came up in our recent meeting that we had with chefs, where we were having this debate. We'd had somebody come and talk from Eat Lancet, and they talked all about it. And the next day we had Patrick Holden from the Sustainable Land Trust talking about, cattle and how you should eat meat, and that's very sustainable. And so there was this like conversation where we were hearing both sides of the story, which is something we really believe in at the Chefs Manifesto. Is we don't want to tell people what to think, we let them decide. But out of that conversation, one of the chefs said, okay, hands up, who's a meat eater and who's a vegan? And it was at that point that I realized this is our problem, because that's the debate that's going on,
right?
Which is we push it out to the extremes, which say you're either a meat eater or you're a vegan, which is kind of crazy, because what's a meat eater? You think about it. It's not somebody walking, like there's no one walking around just chewing on a leg of a cow. And if we all became vegan, it's actually a problem as well, because the world can't actually support that, without the climate going crazy. So we've got to these extremes where the debate happens in the media, and people then get lost when
it
they're
becomes
in the
very
middle,
black and white, and
going, am I meant to be that or am I meant to be that? Instead of actually looking at what the message is, which the message is saying, we need to change how we create a plate. We need to stop seeing the animal-based protein as what the plate is designed around. And that's something that in the chef
I agree,
world,
and there's been some good examples of that. There was restaurant, The Grain Store, wasn't there? Bruno Lebois, I think he did a great menu there a few years ago when they were open, where he had really, and this was before everyone was talking about this, and he was really championing this idea of, you can have 7 courses and there could be meat on a couple of them, but it would really, it's not the protagonist, it's not the main focus of what that dish is meant to be about. And, that's inspired even things like what we do on our menu here, which is we'll have meat on 1 or 2 kind of out of 10 courses. But the idea is you can do so much with all these other ingredients.
Exactly. And this is this is where I see, and this is about the different thinking. And so, when it comes to the plate, that's the kind of conversation that I think chefs can lead on. I remember I was with Gaston Acurio, and he said to me, I'm going to create this plate, but I'm going to use meat as the garnish. So I'm going to put a small piece of animal-based protein on the top to garnish, and just top the rest of the other ingredients which I've profiled. And I remember the language that he used of just changing the concept of building that was not what I'd ever grown up with. So I'd always grown up with, what are we having for? Is it chicken, sausages, steak? What are we having for dinner? And then we'll have some vegetables as a garnish or on the side. Whereas by saying we're having cauliflower, people go, but that's not a real meal. Like, that's rabbit food. You know, like there's still this concept. And even in the way that a kitchen is run, you know, if you think about the progression of chef training.
The stocks and the meat section's the last thing you get.
Exactly. And that's kind of, you've arrived. You're now a chef. God, we trust you with that. But when you talk to
that's as well the most valuable product that you have. That's where from food waste, that's where the money all counts, really. No one was sitting there worrying about how much apple you peeled. They were worried about how much meat you were trimming.
Yeah, but then you talk to like a plant-based chef in London who was doing a plant-based meat, you know, tasting, and she's saying, you know, for me to prepare a cauliflower in an amazing way and to do this takes so much more work and so much more money. To take a steak and turn it over is actually probably the easiest thing that you can do in the kitchen. You need to know how long, you need to have bought the right product, but literally it's turning it over. To do the 15 things that I do to the cauliflower before you eat it, actually, but I can charge 17 quid for the cauliflower and I can charge 28 for the steak. And so there's still a problem there with our system and our culture. And this is where I see working with chefs around sustainability can shift some of these trends. So, and then using the reports and stuff like that. So like where I looked at like the Eat Lancet is I look at the plate and I go, okay, I need to eat less animal-based protein. Smaller portions. I need to have more veg, more grains. I wasn't eating enough grains, seeds and nuts. So now seeds have become a lot more a part of our food at home and now cooking, and we look for them. And you just sort of say, okay, where is those dials? How do I increase certain things? And that creates more interest. You know, it creates diversity, it creates flavor, it creates experience, and it also then supports the market for those ingredients. That grows, you know, and then that helps the environment in terms of what's growing on the farm. You know, so this is where these shifts have to happen. And I think sometimes these are the conversations that need to happen more, where it's not about either or the extremes. It's about what you can do in the middle and the small shifts you can make, which can actually all ladder up to make a massive impact.
And when you're going across the world, do you find that a lot of the chefs that you're dealing with or that you're talking to, is there a general sense of optimism with the direction that we're going in? Or is there, you know, because when you read the news, it's quite, you kind of feel like we're heading on a really fast downward trajectory. Chefs are on the front lines. They're seeing what people are actually buying. They're seeing what people are actually consuming. Are people really enjoying this stuff? Are they enjoying it because it's trendy? Or are people getting as much enjoyment out of, because I often wonder about this. You know, a lot of people who go on vegan diets, a lot of people who go on plant-based diets, I get that, but as you said, it's kind of not moderate enough in terms of, I think it's a bit too extreme. And I wonder in the long run if people really enjoy them. I guess what I'm asking is, are the chefs that you're talking to, is the general kind of sense that, no, people are really getting this, people are becoming much more educated, and we're kind of moving in the right. And I'm asking around the world, because if I asked you about the UK, most people are going to say, yes, consumers are becoming much more worldly and educated and want sustainable, zero waste, kind of these are all things that they're tuned into. But globally, is that the case?
So I'd say the trends are sort of starting to move that way, but they're not there yet. So, you know, you still go to most parts of the world and you say, and I mean, the US is not the greatest example, but we were in a part of the world next to one of the largest culinary training schools in the US. And we went to a restaurant. We said, what have you got that's vegan? And they said, well, there's 2 dishes we could take the key ingredient out of and you could have them. And it kind of made us almost fall off our chair, because we were like, this is not, you know, this should have at least one. So we were being told that out of this menu, you could ruin 2 of the main dishes.
Sure.
And you could have something,
you could compromise.
You could have something to eat.
Yeah.
But there was no real option there. So, you know, if I was living in that environment, and this was meant to be the most progressive chef,
sure,
rock star that had, you know, just smashed through, opened this restaurant, and we're like, And we were there with like the head of one of the key authors of the Eat Lancet report, from Harvard, and a bunch of other chefs. And we were just like,
wow.
Now, so to me, I still think there's a big problem because I don't think we have the appreciation at the global level yet for how to use the diversity of ingredients.
Sure.
I think what we've done is we've still got this mindset that's still built around the traditional view that is still being unpacked. Now, in places like the UK, as you said, yes, that's shifting.
Yeah.
And you can go to restaurants now, but there's still not, like when people say to me, oh, can you suggest some vegan or plant-forward restaurants? It's still a very short list that you're putting out there.
Sure.
Very short list.
Yeah.
Now, we're not in any way advocating that everyone should be vegan.
Yeah, sure.
Or plant-based.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that we need to celebrate plants more.
Yeah.
Because they've not been given the same level of celebration as some other ingredients. So we need to find them, discover them, work with them, and we're trying to partner with companies and with chefs that are working in that way. So there's chefs that are, setting up trading on certain ingredients. We're working with, we've done some work with Unilever and WWF on this Future 50 Foods, where they've created a list of 50 foods that they say are good for people and good for planet. And so these are ingredients which they've said should be brought into the menu because they can be grown in a good environmental way, but they also have a good nutritional profile. And so they've created flavor pairings and notes and all these kinds of things for chefs to be able to use to integrate into their menus. And so for us, those kinds of practical examples become good, case studies or examples that you can say to chefs, here's some examples of, if you're just looking for something to do, why don't you take one of these ingredients and try and play with it? Yeah. Get it in your menu, champion it, learn how to use it. And as you start
and are these common everyday ingredients, or are these, if you look at that list, are they a bit obscure? Are they ingredients that chefs aren't maybe used to dealing with? Or
so a lot of them they're regionally they would be used to dealing with some of them, but not globally. So you've got,
but these would be sustainable on a global scale.
They would be sustainable on a global scale, but obviously in certain areas they'd be more seasonal, they'd be more available, they'd make more sense. But a lot of the time, there's things like millets, for example. Most chefs have not had a lot to do with millets. There's, seaweeds, there's, cactus, there's, all kinds of other different things, sometimes it's things like, the beet greens, which most chefs wouldn't know what to do except throw in the compost. They wouldn't know how to treat it. They wouldn't know how to use it. They wouldn't know how to pair it. But it's in every kitchen. Often, not every kitchen, but it's in a lot of kitchens. So these are sometimes it's a skill thing, sometimes it's a question of how, not what. And so this is where then I believe champion chefs can start to demonstrate that, they can start to profile that, they can start to show using their platforms these new ingredients, spark others' interest, spark consumer interest, and find ways to actually bring that in. I think sometimes those chefs, freak out a bit too much about trying to get the consumers interested. If it tastes good, it looks good, it's presented well, people will eat it. Most chefs are incredibly trusted. And cooked with love. And a good story told about it. So sometimes, what goes on in front of you, if you read the things, you wouldn't order it. But if you saw it, you go, I want to try that. And you go, give me some. You love it. And then you get somebody can explain what it is, And so I think sometimes we try to do too much. And that actually kind of creates the end outcome, like we try and sell it on its merit of the nutritional quality, when that's not how people choose food. They choose food on cost, convenience, flavor.
So what's happening? What are the next developments with the Chefs Manifesto? How can people find out more, and how can all the chefs who are listening, how can they get engaged with this? What's kind of coming up next?
So in terms of in the next coming months, we've got a number of events going on. So the way the Chefs Manifesto works is we have events that are happening around the world in different parts. Some of them are at global events, so we'll be at the UN over the September Climate Summit General Assembly.
Cool.
We're then in Rome during the Committee on Food Security. So with some of these big global events, we'll actually have a presence at. But then we've got our Irish Hub launching. We're going to be participating in a number of other events around the world in different parts that are going to be more localized events. The best way to find out what is going on is to go to chefsmanifesto.com. That's where you can also sign up if you're a chef, and it's a simple survey. We send you a monthly newsletter then, and that gives you the kind of key dates, the specifics, but also some of the calls to action. So,
does the website chefsmanifesto.com?
Yeah.
And does that have the kind of SDG, the strategic goals laid out, and because I had a great brochure which I had out on the desk a day or so ago in preparation for this, and I was looking through. So can they get a copy of that or download that?
So it's downloadable. It's in Spanish, French, German, a number of different languages, I think, and we're trying to encourage and increase more translation of that. So we just had an event launch in China. So we're talking with the team in China. There's 40 chefs in China just signed up. So there's a lot more kind of spread going out. The way that we work is we try and work with local partners, local chefs that are passionate. And that's because this has to be used and applied locally. You can have great conversations at the global level, but the action happens in the kitchen, in a space with ingredients that comes from a place. And so you've got to then adapt these global ideas to what makes sense in your local space. And so, we were recently in Nigeria where we're working with the team there, and then we'll go to India and we'll go to, Canada or
And what Peru. Are the teams there doing? What are they working on?
So they're working usually in their own kitchens, in their own businesses, and which is the number one thing of sustainability is your business has got to run.
Sure.
And so they're running that. Often we partner them with organizations that have got an agenda for local food activity. Sometimes universities, training schools. It depends.
Okay.
And we partner with them in a way to implement locally and kind of use the narrative to engage others. And so they bring together conversations and dialogue, and that is a space where people can come and learn. And then, the other thing is follow on Instagram, Chefs Manifesto. We share stories, content, that comes.
That's how I keep a track of your life.
So that's always become an easy way for people to scroll through, see stories, and then be able to keep track of things. But we're always trying to uncover and tell more stories. So we're always on the lookout also for what's happening. One thing we are going to also be doing is pulling together a set of case studies on different issues that can be really helpful. And we're also doing a bit of work on biodiversity promotion. And so we've got this thing called 2020 for 2020, which is recruiting 2020 chefs to put ingredients on their menu and then talk about them online. And so it's a way of really encouraging the conversation around biodiversity and new ingredients. And so we're going to be doing some activities, some competitions around recipes and things like that in the coming months as well.
Amazing. And all the details are available on chefsmanifesto.com.
Exactly.
Paul, it's been amazing. I'm so looking forward to coming to the next meeting. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah.
Do you guys have a podcast as well that's coming out?
Yeah, so we're just in the process of doing that. So it'll probably be out by the end of the year. So,
awesome. So that's something to look out for.
It's going to be a chef-to-chef conversation. So we're just in the process based on the 8 thematic areas. And so we've started recording, but it's just we don't have a release date just yet.
Awesome. Paul, thank you so much for coming to the studio.
No, thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome.
Thank you.